Alexander Blackwood leaned back in his leather chair, absently watching the Boston skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office. Rain pattered against the glass, mirroring his somber mood, despite the multi-billion-dollar acquisition he'd finalized that morning. At 45, Alexander had everything money could buy: a tech empire valued at $8.7 billion, properties across 3 continents, and a collection of rare sports cars that made enthusiasts weep. Yet something had been off lately, a hollow feeling he couldn't shake. His assistant knocked twice before entering. "Mr. Blackwood, your 3 o'clock charity meeting is here." Alexander nodded, straightening his bespoke suit. The Blackwood Foundation's annual review of scholarship recipients was a perfunctory obligation, something his PR team insisted upon. "Send them in, Jessica." A woman in her 30s entered, professional in a modest blue suit, followed by a small boy around 7 years old. Her introduction barely registered as Alexander's attention fixed on the child. There was something eerily familiar about the boy's features. The same sharp jawline, the same unusual gray-blue eyes that stared back at Alexander from his own mirror every morning. "This is Tyler," the woman, Ms. Reynolds, he now recalled, was saying. "One of our most promising scholarship recipients. His mother works 3 jobs, and Tyler here is already showing remarkable aptitude in mathematics and computer science." The boy smiled shyly, clutching his backpack. When he moved to retrieve something, the bag tumbled sideways, spilling its contents across the polished floor. Among the scattered homework and pencils lay a worn photograph in a plastic sleeve. Alexander bent to help collect the items when the photograph caught his eye. His blood ran cold. It was him, a much younger version from nearly 8 years ago, standing beside a woman he'd tried desperately to forget. "That's my daddy," Tyler said proudly, reaching for the photo. "Mommy says he had to go away because he was very important and busy." The room seemed to tilt beneath Alexander's feet. Memories flooded back. Elizabeth Harrow, the brilliant programmer he'd hired during Blackwood Tech's early days. Their brief, intense relationship. The bitter argument when she'd refused to sell her revolutionary algorithm to him. Her sudden resignation. He'd never known she was pregnant. He'd never known he had a son. Ms. Reynolds was speaking again, confusion evident in her voice at his reaction, but Alexander couldn't hear her over the rushing in his ears. The face that had seemed so familiar now made perfect sense. It was his own, reflected in a child he never knew existed. "My name is Theo Teller. And if this introduction has already piqued your curiosity, leave your light to follow the unfolding of this extraordinary journey. Which city are you watching this from? Let us know in the comments below." "Tyler," Alexander managed, his voice barely audible. "Who is your mother?" The boy smiled brightly. "Elizabeth Harrow. She's super smart. She teaches me coding already." Elizabeth, the only woman who had ever challenged him intellectually. The only woman he had ever truly respected, and now, apparently, the mother of his child. Alexander's mind raced through implications. Why hadn't she told him? Why apply for his scholarship program? Was this deliberate, a way to force a confrontation, or had fate played the cruelest of coincidences? Before he could formulate another question, his phone buzzed with the DNA testing app he used for vetting potential business partners. A habit born from previous betrayals. As though moved by some external force, Alexander found himself asking, "Tyler, would you mind if I check something?" The next 48 hours passed in a blur for Alexander. The DNA test had confirmed what his instincts already knew. Tyler was his son. After the initial shock in his office, he'd managed to maintain his composed exterior long enough to finish the meeting, extracting Elizabeth's current contact information from Ms. Reynolds under the guise of following up on Tyler's exceptional potential. Now he stood outside a modest apartment building in Cambridge, his driver waiting in the idling Bentley behind him. Rain still fell, soaking through his designer coat, but Alexander barely noticed. He'd faced hostile takeovers, bankruptcy threats, and corporate espionage, yet nothing had ever made his heart pound like the prospect of confronting Elizabeth Harrow after all these years. He pressed the intercom button for apartment 3B. After a moment of silence, a familiar voice answered. Older, perhaps, but still with that same confident tone that had once captivated him. Yes, Elizabeth, he said, the name feeling strange on his lips after so long. It's Alexander Blackwood. The silence that followed seemed eternal. Finally, I've been expecting your call since Tyler mentioned meeting you. I didn't think you'd show up in person. The buzzer sounded, and Alexander pushed through the door into a modest lobby. The elevator was out of service, so he took the stairs, each step heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. By the time he reached the third floor, Elizabeth was waiting in her doorway. Time had been kind to her. Her dark hair was shorter now, streaked with a few strands of silver, but her eyes remained sharp and intelligent, currently fixed on him with a complex mixture of emotions he couldn't fully decipher. You should have told me, were the first words out of his mouth. Hello to you too, Alexander, she replied coolly. Please, come in before you make a scene in my hallway. The apartment was small but impeccably organized, bookshelves lined with programming manuals and children's books, a modest dining table covered with circuitry components, and a half-assembled robot. A far cry from the luxury he'd assumed any child of his would be raised in. Tyler is at his after-school program, Elizabeth said, offering no pleasantries. He'll be home in an hour. Why? Alexander demanded, unable to contain himself any longer. Why didn't you tell me I had a son? Elizabeth's posture stiffened. You made your priorities abundantly clear, Alexander. You chose the algorithm over me. You chose business over humanity. When I discovered I was pregnant, I knew exactly what would happen. You'd try to buy your way into fatherhood without doing any of the actual work. Or worse, try to take him from me. That wasn't your decision to make, Alexander snapped, his temper flaring. He's my son. I had a right to know. Did you? Elizabeth crossed her arms. The Alexander Blackwood I knew would have seen a child as either an inconvenience to be managed or an asset to be controlled. Which would Tyler have been to you? The accusation stung because there was truth in it. 8 years ago, he might well have reacted exactly as she feared. The realization sent a wave of shame through him. I've changed, he said, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Elizabeth's laugh was brittle. Really? The ruthless billionaire with a reputation for destroying competitors has suddenly developed a heart? Your company still exploits developing nations for cheap labor. You still crush smaller startups that won't sell to you. The Alexander Blackwood I see in business news is the same man who told me that sentimentality is the enemy of progress when I refused to sell you my work. Her words hit with precision, each one finding its mark. Alexander had spent years building walls around himself, constructing an empire through calculated decisions and emotional detachment. Now, faced with the consequences of that philosophy, he found himself without a defense. I want to know my son, he said finally, his voice quieter. Whatever you think of me, Tyler deserves to know his father. Something in Elizabeth's expression shifted. And what exactly does that mean to you, Alexander? Weekend visits in your penthouse, where you shower him with gifts before sending him back to reality? Or are you planning to sue for custody and turn him into your heir apparent? Before Alexander could answer, the sound of a key in the lock silenced them both. The door swung open, and Tyler bounded in, his backpack bouncing against his small frame. The boy stopped abruptly when he saw Alexander, his eyes widening with recognition. Mr. Blackwood? From the big office? Elizabeth quickly composed herself, moving to her son's side. Tyler, honey, Mr. Blackwood and I need to talk about some grown-up things. Why don't you start your homework in your room, and I'll call you when we're done. Tyler's gaze darted between them, his intuitive mind clearly sensing the tension. Is it about my scholarship? I've been practicing my coding every day, just like you said I should. Alexander felt his chest tighten. The boy was trying to prove his worth, unaware that nothing he could do would make him more valuable in Alexander's eyes than he already was, simply by existing. Your scholarship is secure, Alexander assured him, crouching down to Tyler's eye level, despite the awkwardness of the gesture, for someone unaccustomed to speaking with children. In fact, I'm very impressed by your work." The smile that broke across Tyler's face was like sunshine after a storm, and Alexander was struck by how easily children gave their trust, their approval. In his world of corporate machinations, such genuine reactions were rare. "Go on now," Elizabeth said gently, ruffling Tyler's hair. "We won't be long." Once Tyler had disappeared down the hallway, Elizabeth turned back to Alexander, her expression guarded. "He doesn't know about you. I've kept your picture because he deserves to have some connection to his father, but I've never told him who you really are." Alexander felt a surge of both gratitude and resentment. "And now?" Elizabeth sighed, the weight of the decision evident in her shoulders. "Now, I don't know. This is exactly what I was trying to avoid, having to navigate this complicated situation. Let me be part of his life," Alexander said, surprising himself with the earnestness in his voice. "Not as a distant benefactor, but as his father." "And what happens when you lose interest? When the novelty wears off, or when business calls you away?" Tyler isn't a corporate acquisition you can set aside when something more lucrative comes along. The accusation cut deep, not least because Alexander recognized his own pattern of behavior in her words. How many projects had he abandoned once they no longer captivated his attention? How many relationships had he allowed to wither when work demanded his focus? "I understand your concerns," he said carefully. "I haven't given you reason to trust me. But Elizabeth, seeing him, it's changed something in me." She studied him with the analytical gaze that had first drawn him to her, the ability to see beyond surface details to underlying patterns. "Pretty words, Alexander. I've heard them before." "Then let me show you," he countered. "Give me the chance to prove I can be the father Tyler deserves." Before Elizabeth could respond, Alexander's phone rang, the specific tone that indicated his CFO was calling. Ordinarily, he would answer immediately. The business always came first. His hand moved reflexively toward his pocket, then stopped. Elizabeth's eyebrow rose, a silent challenge. Alexander silenced the phone without checking it, maintaining eye contact with her. "This is more important." Something shifted in Elizabeth's expression, not quite trust, but perhaps the first crack in her wall of certainty about him. "One chance," she said finally. "We start slow. Supervised visits. And at the first sign that you're treating this like another of your projects, it's over." Relief flooded through Alexander, followed immediately by an unfamiliar anxiety. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals with less apprehension than he felt at the prospect of trying to connect with his own child. "When do we tell him?" Alexander asked. Elizabeth considered for a moment. "Today, before you leave. He's perceptive enough to realize something significant is happening. Better he hears the truth from us than pieces it together himself." Alexander nodded, his mind already racing ahead. He would need to rearrange his schedule, postpone meetings, delegate more to his executive team. For the first time in decades, Blackwood Technologies would not be his top priority. Tyler's door opened, and he peeked out cautiously. "Are you guys done with the grown-up talk yet?" Elizabeth exchanged a glance with Alexander, a silent communication passing between them that felt remarkably like their old synergy from years before. "Actually, sweetheart, we need to talk to you about something important. Come sit with us." Tyler sat between them on the worn but comfortable sofa, his small frame dwarfed by the seriousness of the moment. Alexander found himself studying the boy's features with new awareness, the shape of his ears, identical to Alexander's own, the way he furrowed his brow in concentration, just as Alexander did during difficult negotiations. "Tyler," Elizabeth began gently, "do you remember asking me about your father, about why he wasn't with us?" "Oh." The boy nodded, his expression suddenly guarded. "You said he was a very important businessman who had to be away." Elizabeth glanced at Alexander, then back to her son. "Oh, that's right. And that's who Mr. Blackwood is, sweetheart. He's your father." Time seemed to freeze as Tyler processed this information. His eyes widened as he turned to look at Alexander, searching his face with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. "You're my dad?" The question held wonder, confusion, and something like cautious hope. Alexander swallowed hard. Yes, Tyler. I am. Did you know about me before? At your office? The directness of children, something Alexander had forgotten how to navigate in his world of corporate doublespeak. No, he answered honestly. I didn't know until I saw your picture. Your mother and I lost touch before she knew you were coming. Tyler digested this, his sharp mind clearly working through implications. Is that why you looked so surprised when my backpack spilled? Alexander nodded, impressed by the boy's perception. Exactly right. And now you're back because you want to be my dad. The question was delivered with such innocent simplicity that it struck Alexander directly in the heart. I'd like to try, he managed, his voice unexpectedly hoarse. If that's okay with you? Tyler looked to his mother, then back to Alexander. Do you like robots? I'm building one for my science project. The non sequitur caught Alexander off guard, but Elizabeth smiled knowingly. This was how children processed practical questions about how this new reality would affect their immediate world. I do like robots, Alexander replied carefully. In fact, my company builds advanced robotic systems. Tyler's eyes lit up. Really? Can I see them sometime? I think that could be arranged, Alexander said, feeling his way through this unfamiliar territory of fatherhood. Perhaps you could visit my labs. They're not far from here. The conversation flowed more easily after that, with Tyler asking increasingly technical questions that revealed his impressive understanding of engineering concepts. Elizabeth watched silently, her expression unreadable, as Alexander and Tyler discovered their shared fascination with technology. When Tyler finally excused himself to retrieve his robot project from his room, Elizabeth leaned closer to Alexander. He's brilliant, Alexander said quietly. His understanding of programming logic is beyond most college students I've interviewed. A small, proud smile curved Elizabeth's lips. He gets that from both of us. The acknowledgement of their shared connection through Tyler felt significant, the first moment of genuine warmth between them since his arrival. I know this isn't conventional, Alexander said, watching the hallway where Tyler had disappeared. But I'd like to establish some regular time with him. Perhaps I could come for dinner once a week to start, and maybe weekend outings eventually. Stories like these remind us that life can change in an instant, revealing connections we never knew existed. If you appreciate journeys of discovery and second chances, consider subscribing to our channel so you don't miss our next remarkable tale. Elizabeth seemed to measure his sincerity. Thursday evenings could work. He doesn't have after-school activities then. But Thursday evenings, Alexander repeated, already mentally clearing his calendar of the standing executive meeting that had occupied that slot for the past decade. For the first time in his career, business would have to adapt to his personal life, not the other way around. Tyler returned, carefully carrying what appeared to be a partially assembled robotic arm. Mom says I need to improve the servo motor connections, but I can't figure out why it's not responding to the code. Alexander leaned forward, genuinely interested. May I take a look? As Tyler launched into an explanation of his project, Alexander felt a strange sensation unfurl within him, a protectiveness and pride he'd never experienced before. This brilliant, earnest boy was his son. The realization hit him anew, with force enough to momentarily steal his breath. His phone vibrated again in his pocket, likely his executive team wondering why he'd gone off-grid during a critical acquisition week. For once, Alexander didn't feel the compulsive need to check it. Instead, he focused entirely on the mechanical challenge Tyler was describing, aware that something fundamental was shifting inside him. 2 months passed, and Thursday evenings became the highlight of Alexander's week. The initial awkwardness gradually gave way to a comfortable routine. He would arrive at 6 p.m. sharp, often bringing components for Tyler's increasingly sophisticated robot project. They would work together while Elizabeth prepared dinner, and then the three of them would share a meal that, despite being served on mismatched plates in a modest apartment, somehow tasted better than anything from the Michelin-starred restaurants Alexander frequented. Tonight, however, Alexander arrived to find Tyler unusually subdued, picking at his food instead of enthusiastically explaining his latest coding breakthrough. "Everything okay, buddy?" Alexander asked, the paternal endearment still feeling new on his tongue. Tyler shrugged, pushing peas around his plate. "Mason Thornton said you're not my real dad because you weren't there when I was born." Elizabeth and Alexander exchanged a glance, loaded with unspoken concern. Alexander had known this moment would come eventually, the inevitable questions about his absence from Tyler's life, but he hadn't expected it so soon. "Tyler," Alexander said carefully, "Mason doesn't understand our situation. I am your biological father, but he's right that I wasn't there when you were younger, and I'm sorry for that." "Why weren't you?" Tyler asked directly, his gray-blue eyes, so like Alexander's own, suddenly intense. Elizabeth intervened gently. "Tyler, remember what we discussed about grown-up relationships being complicated?" "I want to hear it from him," Tyler insisted, with a stubborn set to his jaw that Alexander recognized from his own reflection. Alexander drew a deep breath. How could he explain corporate ambition, emotional avoidance, and interpersonal failings to a 7-year-old? "Your mother and I had a disagreement about work," he began cautiously. "I made some choices that hurt her feelings, and we stopped talking to each other. She didn't know how to reach me when she found out about you." It was a massive simplification of the situation, but Tyler seemed to accept it, nodding thoughtfully. "So it wasn't because you didn't want me?" The question hit Alexander like a physical blow. "No, Tyler, never that. If I had known about you, I would have wanted to be in your lives." The words came out with surprising ease, perhaps because they were absolutely true. Tyler's expression brightened slightly. "Mason also said billionaires have swimming pools inside their houses. Do you have one?" The sudden shift back to childlike curiosity released the tension in the room. "I do, actually, in my New York penthouse." "Could I see it sometime?" Tyler asked hopefully. Alexander glanced at Elizabeth, silently seeking her approval. Their co-parenting relationship remained delicate, built on gradually accumulating trust. To his surprise, she nodded slightly. "I think we could arrange a visit soon," Alexander replied, unable to keep the smile from his face. Later, after Tyler had gone to bed, Alexander lingered in the small living room, discussing logistics with Elizabeth. "He's never been on a private jet," she said, a hint of concern in her voice. "I don't want him getting used to a lifestyle I can't provide." "I understand," Alexander replied, choosing his words carefully, "but I don't want to hide who I am from him either. Perhaps we can find a balance, experiences without excess." Elizabeth studied him with that penetrating gaze he'd once found so challenging in the boardroom. "You've surprised me these past weeks, Alexander. You haven't missed a single Thursday. Your calls and messages are actually about Tyler, not your corporate agenda. You seem genuinely interested in his life." The observation warmed something in Alexander's chest. "He's an extraordinary kid." "He is," Elizabeth agreed softly. "And he's starting to care about you. That's what worries me." Alexander understood her concern. In his corporate life, he was known for his ruthless focus, his ability to discard anything or anyone that no longer served his objectives. Elizabeth had every reason to fear he would eventually treat fatherhood the same way. "I've been seeing someone," Alexander admitted suddenly, "a therapist, for the first time in my life." Elizabeth's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. "You? In therapy?" Alexander nodded, feeling strangely vulnerable. "I realized I needed help understanding how to be a good father, how to balance work and family, how to process emotions I've spent decades suppressing. He paused, meeting her gaze directly. I don't want to make the same mistakes my father made with me. The admission hung between them, perhaps the most honest thing he'd ever said to her. Elizabeth's expression softened slightly. Taking Tyler to New York would be a big step, she said finally. I'd need to come along, at least this first time. Of course, Alexander agreed immediately. We could use the company apartment. It has 3 bedrooms, and I'd arrange separate transportation for you both if you're uncomfortable on my jet. As they worked through the details, Alexander found himself imagining showing Tyler the robotics lab at Blackwood Tech's Manhattan headquarters, introducing him to the engineering team, watching his son's eyes light up at the advanced technology. The anticipation he felt had nothing to do with business advantages or public relations, just the simple pleasure of sharing something he loved with his child. The private jet gleamed in the early morning sunlight as Alexander watched Tyler bounce excitedly up the boarding stairs, Elizabeth following with a mixture of apprehension and resignation. This weekend trip to New York represented a significant milestone in their evolving family dynamic, the first time Tyler would be immersed in Alexander's world rather than Alexander visiting theirs. Mr. Blackwood, the pilot greeted him with a respectful nod. We're cleared for takeoff in 15 minutes. Thank you, Captain Harris, Alexander replied, before following his son and Elizabeth into the luxurious cabin. Tyler's eyes were wide as saucers as he took in the cream leather seating, polished wood tables, and state-of-the-art entertainment system. This is your plane? He asked incredulously. The whole thing. It belongs to the company, Alexander clarified, catching Elizabeth's approving glance at his attempt to downplay the extravagance. But yes, we'll be the only passengers today. Tyler immediately began exploring every compartment and feature, asking rapid-fire questions about the aircraft's speed, altitude capabilities, and fuel consumption. Alexander answered each query patiently, impressed by the boy's technical curiosity. Elizabeth settled into a window seat, her posture revealing her discomfort with the opulence surrounding them. This is how you travel every week? Alexander nodded, suddenly seeing the jet through her eyes, the excess, the carbon footprint, the conspicuous display of wealth. It saves time, he said, the justification sounding hollow even to his own ears. Though lately I've been questioning whether the time saved is actually spent wisely. Something in his tone must have communicated genuine reflection, because Elizabeth's expression softened slightly. Tyler hasn't stopped talking about this trip all week. His teacher said he's been researching New York skyscrapers instead of doing his assigned reading. Alexander smiled, settling into the seat across from her as Tyler continued his exploration of the aircraft. I've arranged a tour of our robotics division tomorrow. The head engineer knows to keep things age-appropriate, but technically accurate. He'll love that, Elizabeth admitted, then lowering her voice. Alexander, I need to be clear about something. I'm allowing this weekend because Tyler deserves to know all aspects of his heritage, but I don't want him getting used to this. She gestured at their surroundings. Private jets, penthouses, servants. It's not the life we'll be living. The we in her statement pointedly excluded him, Alexander noted. Despite their thawing relationship, Elizabeth remained determined to maintain the boundaries between their worlds. I understand, he replied carefully, though I hope you know that if you ever needed anything. We don't, she cut him off firmly. I've built our life carefully, Alexander. We're comfortable. Tyler has everything he needs. Before Alexander could respond, Tyler bounded back to them, bubbling with excitement. There's a bathroom with a shower on an airplane. As the jet taxied for takeoff, Alexander found himself watching Tyler and Elizabeth, struck by the realization that despite his billions, they had created a complete, functional life without any contribution from him. The thought left him with a strange mixture of admiration and melancholy. The flight passed quickly, with Tyler dividing his attention between the spectacular views, the lavish breakfast service, and the tablet Alexander had brought him loaded with advanced coding tutorials. Elizabeth gradually relaxed enough to accept a glass of champagne, and by the time they began their descent into New York, the atmosphere had become almost companionable. Alexander's driver met them at the private terminal, loading their modest luggage into the waiting Bentley. As they glided through Manhattan traffic toward the company apartment in Tribeca, Tyler pressed his face against the window, captivated by the iconic skyline. "Which one is your building?" he asked excitedly. Alexander pointed toward a sleek glass tower dominating the midtown horizon. "That one, Blackwood Tower. We'll visit my office tomorrow after the robotics lab." Tyler turned to him with shining eyes. "Do people know you're my dad?" The innocent question caught Alexander off guard. In fact, he had told virtually no one about Tyler's existence. Not his executive team, not his board of directors, not the handful of people he might have once called friends. His paternity remained a closely guarded secret, partly out of respect for Elizabeth's privacy, but also, he now realized, because he wasn't sure how Tyler would fit into the carefully constructed narrative of his life. "Not many people know yet," he answered honestly. "Would you like them to?" Tyler considered this with surprising seriousness for a 7-year-old. "I think so. Mason Thornton would definitely stop saying you're not my real dad if it was on the news." Elizabeth interjected gently. "Tyler, remember what we discussed about privacy. Not everything needs to be public knowledge." Alexander watched this exchange with interest. Elizabeth clearly had reservations about Tyler being publicly identified as the Blackwood heir, concerns that were entirely valid given the media scrutiny and security issues that would inevitably follow. "Perhaps we can discuss this more over the weekend," Alexander suggested diplomatically. "For now, let's get settled at the apartment. I believe the housekeeper has prepared lunch." As they pulled up to the discreet entrance of the luxury building, Alexander noticed Elizabeth taking in the uniformed doorman, the marble lobby, the private elevator accessed with a key card. Her expression revealed nothing, but he sensed her cataloging each symbol of wealth, each reminder of the gulf between their daily realities. The apartment occupied the entire 38th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city. Tyler immediately ran from room to room, marveling at the space, the technology, the views. Elizabeth stood silently in the foyer, her arms crossed protectively across her chest. "I chose this one because it felt the least ostentatious of the company properties," Alexander explained quietly, "though I realize that's relative." "It's larger than our entire apartment building," Elizabeth replied, a hint of wry humor in her voice. As they watched Tyler discover the terrace garden, complete with a small putting green and telescope, Alexander was struck by an uncomfortable realization. He had been living in a bubble of extreme privilege, so normalized that he could consider a 6,000-square-foot apartment understated. Seeing his world through Elizabeth and Tyler's eyes was forcing a re-evaluation he hadn't anticipated. Dinner that evening was a strange blend of the extraordinary and the mundane. A private chef prepared their meal in the apartment's gourmet kitchen, yet the conversation revolved around Tyler's school projects and weekend plans, just as it would have in Elizabeth's modest Cambridge apartment. Alexander found himself increasingly attuned to the dissonance between these two worlds he was now straddling. After Tyler had gone to bed, exhausted from the day's excitement, Alexander joined Elizabeth on the terrace. The Manhattan skyline glittered before them as he handed her a glass of wine. "He's asleep already," Elizabeth said, accepting the glass. "Normally, I have to practically wrestle him into bed." "The excitement wore him out," Alexander replied, settling into the chair beside her. "He's an amazing kid, Elizabeth. You've done an incredible job raising him." She studied him over the rim of her glass, It wasn't always easy. I can imagine, Alexander said, though in truth he couldn't, not really. His understanding of financial struggle was theoretical at best, a distant memory from his early entrepreneurial days before Blackwood Technologies had revolutionized secure communications. Elizabeth seemed to read his thoughts. No, you can't, she said, without rancor. You have no idea what it's like to choose between paying for heat or buying groceries, to work 3 jobs while finishing a degree, to explain to your 4-year-old why he can't have the same toys his friends have. Alexander absorbed this, feeling the weight of his absence from those difficult years. I would have helped, Elizabeth. Whatever you think of me, I would never have left you to struggle like that. If you had known, she acknowledged. But that's not the point, Alexander. The point is that we managed. Tyler has never gone hungry. He's never been cold. He's never felt unloved or unwanted. Money isn't everything. I know that, Alexander began, but Elizabeth cut him off with a skeptical look. Do you? Your entire life is built around accumulating more of it. Your worth, your identity is measured in billions. Even your friendships are transactional. The assessment stung, particularly because Alexander couldn't entirely refute it. His closest relationships were indeed with business associates, people who ultimately wanted something from him. When had he last connected with someone simply for the pleasure of their company? I'm trying to change, he said quietly. Seeing you and Tyler, it's made me question things I've taken for granted. Elizabeth's expression softened slightly. I've noticed. The Alexander I knew 8 years ago wouldn't have spent hours helping a child troubleshoot a servo motor. A comfortable silence fell between them as they gazed out at the city lights. Alexander found himself contemplating how different his life might have been if he had made different choices 8 years ago, if he had valued his connection with Elizabeth over the acquisition of her algorithm. I need to tell you something, Elizabeth said suddenly, her voice taut with an emotion Alexander couldn't immediately identify. Something I should have told you when you first came to my apartment. Alexander turned to face her, alarmed by her serious tone. What is it? Is Tyler okay? Tyler's fine, she assured him quickly. It's about my health. Last year, I was diagnosed with a rare form of leukemia. The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. What? Elizabeth, she held up a hand, stopping him. I am in remission. The treatment protocol was successful, and my prognosis is good. But it was touch and go for a while, and it made me think about Tyler's future. Alexander's mind raced, processing implications. Is that why you applied for the Blackwood Foundation scholarship? To establish a connection? Elizabeth nodded. Partly. I never intended for you to meet Tyler directly, just for your foundation to be aware of him, to maybe keep an eye on his education if something happened to me. But then you recognized him, and here we are. So, why didn't you tell me this immediately? Alexander asked, struggling to keep his voice steady as he considered how close he had come to never knowing his son at all. Because I didn't want your involvement to be based on pity or obligation, Elizabeth replied firmly. I wanted to see if you could genuinely care about Tyler for who he is, not because you felt responsible for a potentially motherless child. Alexander stared at her, a complex mixture of emotions churning within him. Anger at being manipulated, however well-intentioned, fear at the thought of Elizabeth's illness returning, and something else, a grudging admiration for her strength and foresight. I understand why you did it, he said finally. But you should have told me, Elizabeth. Not just about your health, but about Tyler from the beginning. We could have worked something out. I wouldn't have tried to take him from you. She sighed, looking suddenly tired. Maybe. But the Alexander Blackwood, who walked away from me 8 years ago, wasn't someone I trusted with the most precious thing in my life. The statement hung between them, both accusation and acknowledgement of change. Before Alexander could respond, His phone vibrated with an incoming call. The screen displayed Naomi Chen, board chair, an unscheduled call that would normally demand his immediate attention. Elizabeth watched as he glanced at the phone. "You should take that. It's after hours on a Friday. Must be important." Instead, Alexander silenced the phone and tucked it away. Nothing that can't wait until Monday." Elizabeth's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. "The Alexander I knew would never have said that." "I'm not that Alexander anymore," he replied simply. Something shifted in Elizabeth's expression. A softening, a reassessment. "No," she agreed quietly. "I don't think you are." Later that night, unable to sleep in the meticulously designed guest room, Alexander found himself drawn to Tyler's door. Opening it silently, he peered in at his sleeping son, face peaceful in the dim glow of a nightlight. The wave of protectiveness that swept through him was unlike anything he had ever experienced, fiercer than ambition, more powerful than pride. In that moment, with unexpected clarity, Alexander Blackwood, the man who had built an empire through calculated decision-making, made a decision from the heart. Whatever it took, whatever he had to change or sacrifice, he would be the father Tyler deserved. Not just a biological connection or a financial provider, but a true parent, present and engaged. As he closed the door gently, his phone vibrated again. This time, it was a news alert from the financial press. Blackwood Tech shares fall 3% amid CEO's unexpected absence during critical acquisition talks. For the first time in his career, Alexander found that he simply didn't care. The morning of their scheduled tour of Blackwood Technologies arrived with unexpected complications. Alexander's phone had been buzzing incessantly since dawn. Urgent messages from his executive team regarding the faltering acquisition and concerned inquiries from board members about his sudden disengagement. After the third call from his CFO, Alexander reluctantly stepped onto the terrace to address the situation. "David, I understand your concerns," he said firmly into the phone. "But my decision stands. If Nexus Technologies won't agree to our revised terms, we walk away." "Alex, this acquisition has been your obsession for 18 months, his CFO protested. "You've personally led every strategy session. Now you're suddenly fine with losing it? The board is asking questions I can't answer." Alexander gazed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching as Elizabeth helped Tyler with his breakfast in the kitchen. The domestic scene struck him as infinitely more valuable than any corporate conquest. "Things change, David. Priorities shift." Alexander's tone left no room for further debate. "Call an emergency board meeting for Monday morning. I'll explain everything then." As he ended the call, Alexander became aware of Elizabeth standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Trouble at the office?" she asked. "Nothing I can't handle," he replied, pocketing his phone. "Ready for our tour?" The Blackwood Technologies headquarters occupied the top 15 floors of his namesake tower, a gleaming monolith of glass and steel in Midtown Manhattan. As their private elevator ascended to the 87th floor where the robotics division was housed, Tyler bounced on his toes with barely contained excitement. "Will there be real AI robots?" he asked for perhaps the 5th time that morning. "The kind that can think for themselves?" "Some of our prototypes have advanced machine learning capabilities," Alexander explained patiently, "though true artificial general intelligence is still theoretical." The elevator doors opened onto a vast laboratory space, where teams of engineers worked at various stations, surrounded by robotic components, holographic displays, and testing chambers. Alexander had arranged for the division to operate at weekend capacity, limiting the number of employees present while ensuring enough activity to showcase the technology. Dr. Mei Zhan, the brilliant director of robotics, whom Alexander had personally recruited from MIT 3 years earlier, approached them with a warm smile. "Mr. Blackwood, welcome, and this must be the young engineering prodigy I've heard about." Alexander performed introductions, carefully referring to Tyler as "my son," with a natural confidence that belied how new the words still felt on his tongue. He noticed Elizabeth's slight surprise at his public acknowledgement of their relationship. Dr. Jan knelt to Tyler's level. "I understand you're building a robotic arm for your science project. Would you like to see how we design similar components here?" Tyler nodded enthusiastically, and they were soon immersed in a comprehensive tour of the facility. Alexander watched with pride as his son asked increasingly sophisticated questions, impressing even the veteran engineers with his understanding of fundamental principles. The few employees present tried to hide their curiosity about this previously unknown Blackwood heir, but Alexander caught the speculative glances and whispered conversations. By Monday, rumors would be circulating throughout the company. He found he didn't mind. As they approached a restricted area marked Project Prometheus, Alexander hesitated. The initiative housed there, an experimental neural interface technology, was among Blackwood Tech's most classified projects, with potential military applications that had attracted controversial defense contracts. "Perhaps we should skip this section," he suggested, attempting to guide the group toward the less sensitive consumer robotics division. But Tyler had already spotted the intriguing signage. "What's Project Prometheus? Is that like in the Greek myth where he stole fire from the gods?" Dr. Zhang looked to Alexander questioningly, clearly uncertain how to proceed. Elizabeth, picking up on the sudden tension, moved closer to Tyler. "It's a special project that's not quite ready for visitors," Alexander explained, but even as the words left his mouth, he felt a discomfort he hadn't experienced before. For years, he had compartmentalized his business decisions from any moral considerations. Project Prometheus represented cutting-edge innovation, potential market domination, and significant government contracts, all measures of success in his previous value system. Now, looking at his son's innocent curiosity, Alexander found himself reconsidering the technology's potential applications. The neural interfaces were being developed with combat enhancement capabilities, essentially turning soldiers into more efficient weapons. Was this the legacy he wanted to leave for Tyler? "Actually," Alexander said suddenly, "Project Prometheus is being reassessed. Dr. Jan, please inform the team that I want a complete ethical review of all potential applications, with civilian medical uses prioritized over military contracts." Dr. Jan's eyes widened slightly in surprise. This represented a significant strategic pivot, but she nodded professionally. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood. I'll convene the ethics committee immediately." Elizabeth studied Alexander with newfound interest as they continued the tour, clearly noting the impromptu policy change. When Tyler was absorbed in a demonstration of micro-robotics, she leaned closer to Alexander. "That seemed important." "It was," he acknowledged quietly. "Some business directions that seemed acceptable before don't anymore." The remainder of the tour proceeded smoothly, culminating in a visit to Alexander's executive suite on the 100th floor. The corner office offered spectacular views of Central Park and the Hudson River beyond, its minimalist design emphasizing the panorama rather than its occupant status. Tyler approached the floor-to-ceiling windows in awe. "You can see everything from here." "It's quite a perspective," Alexander agreed, standing beside his son, "though sometimes I think it makes everything seem too small, too distant. It's easy to forget there are real people down there, living real lives." Elizabeth caught his eye, something like understanding passing between them. As they prepared to leave, Alexander's assistant Jennifer appeared in the doorway, her normally composed expression strained. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Mr. Zhao from the Chinese Investment Consortium is on the line. He's threatening to withdraw their support if you don't personally address their concerns about the Nexus acquisition immediately. In the past, Alexander would have dropped everything for such a call. Billions in funding and market position in Asia were at stake. He glanced at Tyler, who was now examining the architectural model of Blackwood Tower with fascination, and then at Elizabeth, who watched him with unconcealed interest, clearly curious about his response to this test of his new priorities. "Tell Mr. Zhao I'm unavailable until Monday morning, Eastern Time," Alexander replied calmly. If that timeline doesn't work for him, David Chen has full authority to address his concerns. Jennifer's eyes widened slightly. She had never heard her boss delegate a call of this magnitude, but she nodded professionally. "Yes, sir." As she departed, Elizabeth moved to stand beside Alexander. "That seemed significant too," she observed quietly. "It was," Alexander admitted. "A month ago, I would have taken that call even if I'd been in the middle of emergency surgery." A small smile played at the corners of Elizabeth's mouth. "Fatherhood looks good on you, Alexander." Something warm unfurled in his chest at her words, the first unqualified approval she had offered since his reappearance in her life. Before he could respond, Tyler called out excitedly from across the room, "Dad! Is this button supposed to do something?" "Dad?" The word echoed in Alexander's mind, powerful in its simplicity. It was the first time Tyler had called him that instead of Mr. Blackwood, and the emotional impact caught him entirely off guard. For a man accustomed to controlling his reactions in high-stakes negotiations, the sudden moisture in his eyes was both unfamiliar and unwelcome. He crossed the room quickly, clearing his throat to disguise his emotion. "Which button, Tyler?" As father and son examined the interactive model together, Elizabeth watched them from across the office, her expression contemplative. Whatever calculations she was making behind those intelligent eyes, Alexander could only hope they were trending in his favor. Sunday morning found the three of them in Central Park, a deliberate departure from the corporate environments and luxury settings that had dominated their weekend. Alexander had suggested the outing, sensing that both Elizabeth and Tyler might benefit from some normalcy amid the overwhelming opulence of his world. Tyler raced ahead on the pathway, pausing occasionally to examine interesting rocks or insects with the intense focus characteristic of curious children. Elizabeth and Alexander walked side by side, a comfortable silence between them that would have been unimaginable just a few months earlier. "He called me Dad yesterday," Alexander said finally, still processing the emotional impact of that moment. "I wasn't prepared for how that would feel." Elizabeth smiled softly. "Children have a way of cutting through our defenses. That's part of their magic and their terror." "I keep thinking about all the firsts I missed," Alexander admitted, watching as Tyler crouched to observe a line of ants crossing the path. "His first words, first steps." "His first word was code," Elizabeth offered unexpectedly. "Not mama or anything traditional, just code. I was debugging a program while holding him, talking through the logic the way they recommend reading to babies, and he just looked up and said it, clear as day." Alexander laughed, a genuine sound that felt foreign after years of calculated business chuckles. "Of course it was. He's brilliant, Elizabeth. Just like his mother." She accepted the compliment with a nod, her expression growing more serious. "I've been watching you this weekend, Alexander. The way you interact with Tyler, the decisions you've made, even the way you've handled your business responsibilities. You're not the man I remember." "Is that a good thing?" he asked, finding himself genuinely concerned about her assessment in a way that would have been incomprehensible to his former self. "I think so," she replied thoughtfully. "The Alexander I knew was brilliant but cold, focused but detached. You seem more human now." They reached a playground where Tyler had already joined other children on the climbing structure, his laughter blending with theirs in the universally recognizable joy of childhood play. I've been thinking about next steps, Elizabeth said, as they settled on a bench overlooking the playground. Tyler needs stability, consistency. Alexander tensed, fearing she was about to restrict his access again. I agree completely. I can adjust my schedule permanently to ensure our Thursday evenings continue, and perhaps add a weekend day every... That's not what I meant, Elizabeth interrupted gently. I'm talking about a more comprehensive arrangement. Alexander waited, barely breathing, as she gathered her thoughts. My medical treatments last year depleted my savings, she continued. I've been struggling to maintain our apartment while keeping Tyler in his enrichment programs. His school has recommended he transfer to a private academy for gifted children, but the tuition is well beyond my means. I can handle all of that, Alexander said immediately. Set up a trust for his education, secure better housing, whatever you need. Elizabeth held up a hand, stopping him. I'm not asking for charity, Alexander. I'm suggesting a co-parenting agreement, a formal legal recognition of your paternity and financial responsibilities, coupled with defined visitation and involvement in decisions about Tyler's future. The proposal took Alexander by surprise, not because it was unreasonable, but because it represented a level of trust he hadn't dared hope for so soon. You'd be comfortable with that? With me having legal rights as his father? A month ago, no, Elizabeth admitted frankly. But you've proven yourself more capable of change than I expected. More importantly, Tyler adores you. The way his face lights up when he talks about Dad's robots or Dad's building. I haven't seen him this excited about anything since before my diagnosis. Alexander felt his throat tighten with emotion. I want to be part of his life, Elizabeth. Not just financially, but in every way that matters. She nodded, watching Tyler navigate the jungle gym with determined concentration. I know. That's why I'm suggesting we discuss a more permanent arrangement, one where you don't have to fly to Boston every Thursday, and we don't have to limit your time with him to scheduled visits. What exactly are you proposing? Alexander asked carefully, hardly daring to hope for what her words seemed to imply. I've been offered a position at MIT's Computer Science Department, a research role that would allow me more stable hours and better healthcare benefits, Elizabeth explained. If I accept, Tyler and I would need to relocate closer to Cambridge. But you're already in Cambridge, Alexander pointed out, confused. Elizabeth smiled slightly. I meant the original Cambridge, in Massachusetts, MIT's main campus. Understanding dawned. You're considering moving to Boston? She nodded. It would mean better opportunities for both of us. But I'd need help with the transition, finding housing, moving expenses, settling Tyler into a new school. I have properties in Boston, Alexander said, his mind already racing ahead. The Blackwood Foundation maintains a residence in Beacon Hill for visiting scholars. It has 4 bedrooms, a garden. It would be perfect for you and Tyler. And I could arrange immediate enrollment at Boston Academy for gifted education. Elizabeth's eyebrow raised skeptically. Alexander, I'm not asking to live in one of your properties. I want independence, just with your support for Tyler's needs. Of course I understand, he backtracked quickly. But please consider it, not as a handout, but as practical co-parenting. The residence is sitting empty most of the year. You'd be doing the foundation a favor by maintaining it. And with Tyler at Beige, he'd receive the specialized education he needs. Before Elizabeth could respond, Tyler came running over, his cheeks flushed with exertion and excitement. Dad, Mom, there's a chess tournament happening over there. He pointed toward the park's famous chess tables, where players of all ages gathered for impromptu matches. Would you like to watch? Alexander asked, already rising to his feet. Tyler shook his head. I want to play. Can I? Alexander glanced at Elizabeth, who nodded her permission. Do you know the rules already? He asked, surprised. Mom taught me. Tyler said proudly. "I beat her last week, only because I was distracted by a phone call," Elizabeth qualified with a smile. "But he's quite good for his age." They followed Tyler to the chess area, where seasoned players eyed the enthusiastic child with indulgent amusement. An elderly man with a thick Russian accent invited Tyler to a game, clearly expecting a quick, gentle teaching match. To everyone's surprise, especially Alexander's, Tyler held his own remarkably well, demonstrating a strategic understanding that went far beyond basic knowledge of the game. Though he eventually lost to the experienced player, the man was visibly impressed, offering tips and encouraging Tyler to return for more practice. "Your son has a natural talent," the man told Alexander. "You must be very proud." "I am," Alexander replied, the words coming easily now. "Very proud indeed." As they walked back through the park, Tyler running ahead once more, Elizabeth returned to their interrupted conversation. "About Boston. I don't want Tyler to become entitled or disconnected from normal life. The privileges you've shown him this weekend are extraordinary, but they're not reality for most people." "I understand your concerns," Alexander said sincerely, "but denying him opportunities out of principle doesn't seem right either. What if we find balance? He lives primarily with you, maintains the values and groundedness you've instilled, but also has access to educational resources that will challenge his exceptional mind." Elizabeth considered this, watching Tyler examine a butterfly that had landed on a nearby flower. "I could accept that," she said finally, "with conditions. We'd need clear boundaries about extravagant gifts, public exposure, and most importantly, consistency. He can't become attached to you being in his life, only for you to disappear when business calls or you lose interest." The accusation in her last words stung, but Alexander recognized it came from genuine concern rather than malice. "I'm not going anywhere, Elizabeth. Tyler is, both of you are, more important than any business interest." She studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right. Let's discuss the details when we return to Cambridge. I'll need time to consider the MIT offer and what a move would mean for us." As they collected Tyler and headed toward the park exit, Alexander found himself experiencing an unfamiliar emotion: hope. Not the calculated optimism of a business venture with favorable projections, but a genuine personal hope for a future that included this small, extraordinary family that had appeared in his life through chance, and perhaps a touch of fate. 6 months later, Alexander stood in the spacious kitchen of a tastefully renovated brownstone in Boston's Back Bay neighborhood, where morning sunlight streamed through tall windows. The property, a compromise between Elizabeth's desire for normalcy and Alexander's insistence on providing comfort and security, had become the center of their unconventional family lives. He poured coffee into 3 mugs, a standard black one for himself, a MIT-branded mug for Elizabeth, and a smaller cup decorated with robots for Tyler. Outside, through the garden doors, Elizabeth was helping Tyler perfect his science fair project, a sophisticated robotic ecosystem that had already been featured in the Boston Academy for Gifted Education's newsletter. How dramatically his life had transformed since that fateful afternoon when a backpack had spilled its contents across his office floor. The change wasn't just in his physical location, though he now spent 3 days a week in Boston, working remotely from a home office while maintaining his corporate responsibilities in New York, but in something far more fundamental. The Monday after their weekend in New York, Alexander had called an emergency board meeting as promised. Instead of discussing the faltering Nexus acquisition, however, he had announced significant personal and corporate changes. He had publicly acknowledged Tyler as his son and heir, restructured his executive responsibilities to accommodate his new co-parenting arrangement, and initiated a comprehensive ethical review of all Blackwood Technologies divisions. The financial press had exploded with speculation. Stock prices had temporarily dipped before rebounding when analysts recognized that a more balanced CEO might actually benefit the company's long-term stability. Project Prometheus had been redirected toward medical applications, leading to promising breakthroughs in neuroprosthetics for paralysis patients. And most significantly, Alexander had established the Elizabeth Harrow Fellowship for Women in STEM, ensuring that brilliant minds like hers would never again be sidelined by financial or social barriers. "Dad!" Tyler's voice broke through his reflections as the boy bounded into the kitchen, his eyes bright with excitement. "The pollinator robot works. The bees accepted it as part of their colony." "That's fantastic," Alexander replied, handing Tyler his cocoa. "Are you ready for your presentation tomorrow?" "Almost. Mom's helping me prepare for questions from the judges." Tyler took a careful sip of his drink. "Will you both be there?" "Wouldn't miss it," Alexander assured him, just as Elizabeth entered the kitchen. "I've cleared my entire morning," she added, accepting her coffee with a grateful smile. "Professor Chen is covering my lecture." As they settled into their morning routine, Tyler reviewing his presentation notes, Elizabeth checking academic emails, Alexander scanning market reports, the domesticity of the scene struck him anew. This ordinary moment, unremarkable to most families, represented a profound transformation in his life. The three of them had found an unexpected balance. Tyler divided his time between the brownstone's two wings, living primarily with Elizabeth, while spending increasing amounts of time in Alexander's section as their bond deepened. Elizabeth had flourished at MIT, her research earning recognition that had nothing to do with her connection to Alexander, and Alexander himself had discovered a capacity for joy that had been dormant throughout his years of single-minded ambition. Their arrangement wasn't without challenges. The adjustment from billionaire CEO to present father had required consistent effort and occasional guidance from the therapist Alexander continued to see weekly. Elizabeth still maintained firm boundaries around Tyler's exposure to extreme wealth and privilege, and the media's interest in the Blackwood heir had necessitated increased security measures around the brownstone and Tyler's school. Yet these complications seemed insignificant compared to what they had gained. For Tyler, the stability of having both parents actively involved in his life. For Elizabeth, the professional opportunities and co-parenting support she deserved. And for Alexander, a purpose beyond acquisition and achievement. A chance to nurture a legacy more meaningful than any corporate empire. "I should head out," Elizabeth said, checking her watch. "I have office hours before my afternoon lab." "I'll take Tyler to school," Alexander offered, part of their well-established routine. As Elizabeth gathered her materials, she paused beside Alexander. "Don't forget we have that parent-teacher conference at 4. Ms. Abernathy wants to discuss Tyler's advanced placement options for next year." "It's on my calendar," Alexander assured her. "I moved the Tokyo investor call to accommodate it." Elizabeth nodded, a small smile acknowledging this significant shift in his priorities. She leaned in to kiss Tyler's forehead. "Good luck with final preparations. I can't wait to see everything set up tomorrow." After she departed, Alexander and Tyler completed their morning preparations in companionable conversation about robotics, chess strategies, and Tyler's upcoming birthday celebration. As they walked to the waiting car, Alexander had compromised on a less ostentatious vehicle for school drop-offs. Tyler looked up at his father thoughtfully. "Dad, remember when you first came to Mom's apartment? When you told me you were my father?" Alexander nodded, recalling that pivotal afternoon vividly. "Of course. I knew before she told me," Tyler said matter-of-factly. "I saw your picture in a business magazine at my doctor's office once. I recognized your eyes. They're like mine. That's why I kept your photo in my backpack." The revelation stunned Alexander. "You knew? All along?" Tyler shrugged. "Not exactly. I hoped. Mom always said my father was a very important businessman who couldn't be with us. When I saw your picture, I thought maybe it was you. Then when my backpack spilled in your office, you watched for my reaction, Alexander realized, recalling Tyler's intense gaze. Tyler nodded. I wanted to know if you would recognize me too. The implications of this confession washed over Alexander. His son hadn't stumbled into his life by random chance. Tyler had recognized a potential connection and created an opportunity for discovery, demonstrating an emotional intelligence that matched his intellectual gifts. Thank you, Alexander said simply, his throat tight with emotion, for finding me. Tyler smiled. I'm glad I did. As their car navigated Boston's morning traffic, Alexander reflected on the extraordinary sequence of events that had transformed him from a solitary billionaire to a father, co-parent, and fundamentally different man. The change had cost him nothing of real value and given him everything that truly mattered. Later that day, following the parent-teacher conference where Ms. Abernathy had outlined an accelerated educational path tailored to Tyler's exceptional abilities, Alexander and Elizabeth walked through Boston Common, enjoying a rare moment alone while Tyler attended his robotics club. The board is pressuring me to return to New York full-time, Alexander admitted, breaking their comfortable silence. Quarterly results are strong, but they're concerned about leadership presence. Elizabeth nodded, unsurprised. We always knew this arrangement would face corporate resistance eventually. What are you thinking? Alexander considered the question carefully. 5 years ago, I wouldn't have hesitated. The company would have come first, without question. Now there's Tyler, Elizabeth finished for him. And you, Alexander added quietly. This co-parenting arrangement, this life we've built, it matters more than any corporate accomplishment. Elizabeth studied him with those perceptive eyes that had always seen through his defenses. You've changed, Alexander, more than I thought possible. Because of Tyler, he acknowledged, and because you gave me the chance to be part of his life, despite every reason not to trust me. A gentle smile curved Elizabeth's lips. So what will you tell your board? That they have two options, Alexander replied with newfound clarity. Either accept my split schedule between Boston and New York, or begin the search for my replacement as CEO. Elizabeth's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. You'd walk away from Blackwood Technologies, the company you built from nothing? Alexander nodded, the decision crystallizing as he spoke. If necessary. I've missed 7 years of Tyler's life already. I won't sacrifice a single day more for shareholders or profit margins. As they continued their walk, the conversation shifted to more immediate matters. Tyler's upcoming chess tournament, Elizabeth's research publication, the summer vacation they were considering as a family. The corporate decision, momentous though it was, had taken its proper place in Alexander's hierarchy of concerns, important, but no longer paramount. That evening, after Tyler had gone to bed, Alexander stood in the doorway of his son's room, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest. On the bedside table sat the photograph that had changed everything, the one that had fallen from Tyler's backpack that fateful day. Now framed properly, it represented not just the past, but a bridge to their shared future. Alexander Blackwood, who had once measured success in billions, had discovered a different form of wealth, one founded in connection, purpose, and love. The journey from isolated tycoon to devoted father had not been simple or straightforward, but standing in the quiet of his son's room, Alexander knew with absolute certainty that it had led him home. My name is Theo Teller, and I want to thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery and transformation. If you enjoyed this story of second chances and found meaning in Alexander's evolution from isolated billionaire to devoted father, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What moment from Alexander and Tyler's story resonated with you most? Do you have suggestions for future stories you'd like us to explore? Your engagement helps us continue bringing these emotional and authentic narratives to life. Remember to share with someone who might appreciate a story about the things that truly matter beyond wealth and success.